All right. Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. It's a Sunday afternoon. It's not too horribly hot out, and it's late August, so we don't have too much to complain about here. I'm Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. So happy to have you here. We haven't been doing a ton of weekend events, but it's nice to see you. We've been doing lots of Monday nights and Thursday nights, and we'll be back tomorrow doing more this week. But really excited to have you here today, and we'll get to that in just a moment. We have ton of stuff scheduled through the fall. We've been doing these weekly events virtual since April, and we've been having a lot of fun with it. It's really great staying connected to all of you, all of our readers and customers. Yesterday actually was Independent Bookstore Day, and we just had a blast. You know, the store was really booming. We have been kind of keeping a certain amount of people in there at a time, but we had a line out the street all day long as people waited to get into the shop, and you know, I think we're limiting it to 8 people in the shop at a time, but people were patient. They waited and they did that. And I was also glad to see, you know, we have so many great bookstores here in town. It seemed like everybody was really doing great yesterday. And I think sometimes we worry that there's not to be a lot of over competition and things like that, but places like our friends at Fulton Street and the new Eleanor's Bookshop at Mother Road Market and Whitty Books and Kindle Whittier, it seemed like everybody was just having a great day. And that's a really good thing to say, you know, this kind of rising tide lifts all ships mentality, which I very much prescribe to, is a really nice thing to see. So thank you for supporting local bookstores. One event I want to tell you about coming up that's a little bit urgent is we are getting close to selling out our Margaret Atwood event on September 8th. So we're going to be talking to Margaret Atwood. Very excited about that. She's got a sequel out to The Handmaid's Tale and is actually going to be signing books for that. So that's a pretty rare opportunity to get a signed book from Margaret Atwood, and we're going to have her in conversation. So tickets for that are on sale now, but not too much longer. So don't wait on that. Go to magiccitybooks.com and you can get that. A couple of other things to note. A little bit related to what we're going to be talking about today. You guys all remember the events surrounding what was happening on Juneteenth here in Tulsa. Well, in September, we're going to be talking to a journalist named Carl Hoffman, who's spent about a year or so embedding himself in Donald Trump's rallies to kind of see what that really was like. So he's written this new book called Liar's Circus, and it's basically the MAGA rallies from the inside out. And obviously that was very relevant to what was going on here in June. So we're going to be doing an event for that coming up, and a lot of great stuff, a lot of nonfiction this fall, important topics talking about. So go to our website and check that out. Today we are going to be though talking about Black Wall Street 100. I have had the chance, I've been kind of in bookstore world for about 20 years now, believe it or not, and I've had the chance to work with Hannibal Johnson all the way back, probably since early 2000s, and have had a chance for most of the books to do some events around them. But believe it or not, the original Black Wall Street, which I'm sure many of you have, is now 22 years old and came out when the world was very different in terms of how we talk about this topic, this event, this tragedy, this American tragedy. And there is no one in our community who has had their finger on the pulse and kind of led the discussion better than our friend Hannibal Johnson. If you don't know Hannibal's work, he's done a zillion things. Obviously, he's an attorney. He is a writer of many, many books, including Up from the Ashes, Incognegro, Apartheid in Indian Country, and of course the original Black Wall Street, not to mention many others. He's written plays and lots of different things. But this book I know has been in the works for quite some time as we lead up to the Centennial next spring, so I'm excited to talk about it. So Hannibal Johnson, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess I want to begin with a talk about how much has changed about the way we talk about this from 1998 to 2020, right? Of course, in the title of the first book, you refer to it as a riot. And even up till your play, Big Mama Speaks, you talk about it in terms of a riot. So the language has changed. So talk about, you know, how much that has changed, but also what have you learned in the 22 years since the first book? Obviously, it's an ongoing research process, and many people were alive when the first book came out who were actually witnesses to this that are no longer with us. Talk about kind of the interim period and what's been going on.
Well, let's first talk a little bit about nomenclature. So over the last couple of years, folks locally and even nationally have have come to term the event a massacre. So it's referred to as the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Whereas for decades, it was referred to by its historic referent, which is the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. So I like for people to think critically about this nomenclature, because it's not actually axiomatic that we would go from riot to massacre. There's a lot in between. So I really, there's a 5-part process that I think is important for us to think critically through this issue of nomenclature. One is, when we look at the historical reference, the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, who gave the event its name? Who was absent from the table when the name was given out? What is the significance, legally or otherwise, of the naming, of the word riot? It had consequences in terms of insurance coverage, because there were exclusionary clauses based on damage that was occasioned by riot or civil unrest. Number 4 would be, given the factual matter that we've learned about these events, what terms might be appropriate? I think if you ask that question, there are a number of terms that could have applicability. Riot, white riot, assault, pogrom, Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, genocide, massacre. The point being, massacre is one of several terms that could apply to these facts. And then the 5th thing I would ask people to think about is, if such an event were to occur today, what criteria would you develop in order to come up with an appropriate name? So for me, the nomenclature question is all about critical thinking. It's thinking through the naming process. Massacre is an appropriate term, to be sure, but there are other terms that have applicability as well. So I want people to be mindful of that. And beyond that, I don't want anybody to be denigrated or to be shamed for calling it one thing over the other, right? We're mature adults, and we can talk through these issues of nomenclature and agree to disagree in some cases.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because I often hear maybe city officials or anyone, they'll refer to it still as a riot, and maybe sometimes it's reflexive at this point, because it's we did call it that for basically, I would say, up to the last 3 or 4 years, even, probably.
Absolutely. And the other thing that's really interesting is, back in 1998, when Black Wall Street came out, there were a lot of living survivors, and they were interviewed by Eddie Faye Gates. The interviews are archived, and when you listen to those interviews, almost all of them refer to the event as the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot, because that's the language that they knew. So if we now say that using that terminology is wrong, and we're listening to the people who actually lived through these events, it becomes a problem, right? Yeah. So let's think about the various terms that could apply, and let's think about why we settle on one over the other. Now, in terms of the things that have changed since Black Wall Street debuted in 1998, there are many. I think the biggest thing that's changed is, as you well know, in 1997, a statewide commission was convened. That commission issued its final report in 2001. It's an award-winning report. It's available online, the website of Oklahoma Historical Society. That report changed many things, and it also drew worldwide attention to these events. And so that changed the conversation. It stimulated dialogue. It really sparked some changes in curriculum that were much needed. And it really promoted talk about reparations. And when I use the word reparations, I'm not necessarily talking about cash payments to individuals. I'm talking about repairing damage and making amends.
It's interesting you mentioned that period, the late 1990s. When you think about it on the whole, there were a lot of different things happening that kind of worked into this. So, of course, you had your book come out, which remains this kind of omnipresent narrative in our city, at least. And I think for a lot of people looking to know more about this topic. You mentioned the commission. This is the commission that we still utilize for certain numbers, like the determination that there were at least 300 or so deaths during this. Some of those numbers were pulled from that original commission report, which now has, I think people assume that was probably not correct, but at least in the ballpark. So there's that. There was a American Experience documentary that came out then, which I just recently rewatched, called Going Back to T-Town, which was narrated by Ossie Davis and David McCullough. It was one of those kind of PBS shows, interviewing a lot of survivors. They all were referring to it as the race riot at that point. And then you had things like the first time that I ever heard about the events of 1921, I lived here my whole life, was right around that time too, which was when I read a novel by Jewel Parker Rhodes called Magic City, right? Which is a novel that came out around that time. And I'd read Willa Askew's book not too long after that. And so it kind of came to me in a sense of like a historical fiction, which is not the ideal way to learn about something, but it did open a door to kind of look into your book and other books around that time. But it does seem like there was that moment, 97 to say 2000, where there was this reprisal of interest in looking at this. For your book originally, I'm just curious, why do you think that all happened at one time? Was there something that led to that? Obviously, the commission was a big part of that, but you'd been working on your project for how long leading up to 1998?
So I'd been working on Black Wall Street, I would say two, maybe 3 years prior to that. For me, it started with a stint as a guest editorialist with the Oklahoma Eagle, the leading Black newspaper, successor to the Tulsa Star. I was at one point asked to do a 4-part series on the Greenwood District, the community, and I became really interested in the history. Now, Scott Ellsworth did the seminal book on what was then called The Riot. His book is called Death in the Promised Land. It's excellent. Scott is a native Tulsan. He's a professor at the University of Michigan and a friend. That book is excellent. But I told Scott, I am interested in the community. The massacre is an event that occurred in the context of the community. So I'm interested in a more holistic portrait of the community. And that's why it's Black Wall Street, not 1921 Tulsa Race Riot or some title involving the event. Prior to that, as I recall, Ed Wheeler did an article in a magazine called Impact in 1971. That was the 50th anniversary of the massacre. That got a lot of attention, but I believe he got some really negative feedback, death threats, and things like that for even bringing it up. And that tells you how deeply embedded this story was beneath the surface for many Tulsans for many years. You talked about growing up here, not really knowing this history. You didn't know it because it wasn't included in the regular curriculum. So we've begun to address that. We still have ways to go, though.
It's so funny. I remember as a kid, say from 8, 10, 12 years old, every year we would go down to the jazz festival that would happen on Greenwood, and I would see amazing people like Natalie Cole and all these people play there. And when we would be down there, there was just zero context for the space, the history of the place. I just thought it was just a fun area where there was a concert happening. There was zero reference. There was no you think about things like land acknowledgements and things like that. There was no one getting up there on the microphone saying, "Hey, we're on hallowed ground. This happened here at this." It was just absent from the conversation.
I want to give credit to former Representative Don Ross and former State Senator Maxine Horner. They really were the driving force behind getting the commission convened in the first instance in 1997. And again, that was a seminal point because that drove all sorts of attention from external and also internal. So people in the community became more aware of their own history and legacy and more inclined to promote things like the Greenwood Cultural Center, the Oklahoma Jazz Hall of Fame, and things that really emerged in full during that period.
Yeah. For those just joining us, we're talking about Black Wall Street 100 with Hannibal Johnson. Just so you know, we will be putting some links here in the chat function so you can get the book directly from us. We also have a lot of copies in the store, and Hannibal would be by sometime to sign some copies this week. So we will have autographed copies in the store as well if you don't want to buy it online. So do that. And also, if you have questions, please put those in to the Q&A function, and we'll get to those as we continue. One thing you mentioned that I've always loved about your perspective is you talk about really hard periods in the life of our city and our state. But I've never taken you as anything but an optimist. You know, I think, and one of the reasons, like you said, the book is Black Wall Street. You celebrate the culture, and it's not just a look at the massacre or riot, rather, as you described it at the time. You looked at this kind of thriving culture that existed, and also the one thing that I think that still goes unsaid a lot is the second wave, right? The rebuilding of Greenwood, and then the interdispersal loop, and how basically there was a second wave in, I guess, the late 1960s that kind of basically put the nail in that coffin for that community. And I meet a lot of people who grew up in Greenwood. Let's say they're in their 60s, 70s now, and were young people at that time, and talking about going see shows and movies, and there was a thriving cultural life down there. And I remember thinking, like, well, how is that possible? If after 1921, they said, well, we came back. There was a comeback, and you've talked about that too. So could you talk about the kind of way that you've looked at this more as a century of time as opposed to just what happened in 1921?
Absolutely. So let's back up just one step and to say that what happened in terms of the devastation of the community in 1921 happened in a national context, which is to say that this is one of many events in really a nation suffused in racial discord and racial violence. What happened in Tulsa happened in 1921. It comes on the heels of what was called Red Summer, the summer and fall of 1919, in which there were more than 24 major events that were called race riots throughout the United States in places like New York City and Baltimore, Philadelphia, Memphis, Omaha, Washington, D.C., Elaine, Arkansas, and on and on and on. Longview, Texas had one of these events as well. So this is a period in our history, the early part of the 20th century, that sociologists and historians often refer to as the nadir of race relations in America. Nadir is a word meaning the low point. Because of these so-called race riots and because of the proliferation of lynching throughout the United States. Lynching is a form of domestic terrorism, targeting, for the most part, African-American folk. And the intent behind lynching is really to signal to African-Americans that white supremacy still prevails. I mean, that was the real point. It was not simply to punish a target or a victim, but rather to send a group to the send a message to the group to which that person belonged. Again, mostly African Americans. So that's the context in which the Tulsa experience happened. Now, the Black Wall Street portion of it, the entrepreneurship, the economic prowess, that's really important because it helps you understand what was lost in the massacre. Property damage conservatively estimated at the time is $1.5 to $2 million. That's well over $25 million today. And again, that's a low ball estimate. Part of the other problem with looking at this event in isolation, the massacre in isolation, is that just as you noted, many folks think that this massacre happened and Black Wall Street's gone and that's the end of the story. Well, that's not the end of the story, because the story really has to do with the human spirit, the indomitable human spirit, because even after the onslaught in 1921, and even in the face of incredible odds put in front of the people in the Greenwood District by the city and by others, people vowed to stay put, to not be moved, to rebound, to rebuild, and they did that. In 1925, the Greenwood community hosted the National Conference of the National Negro Business League. That was Booker T. Washington's Black Chamber of Commerce. That's 4 years after the massacre. The community peaked as a business community in the early to mid 1940s. There were well over 200 documented Black-owned and operated businesses in the Greenwood District in the early to mid 1940s. Now, the community declined in the late 60s through the 70s and 80s for a number of reasons. You mentioned one of them, urban renewal. Now, In the case of Tulsa, the Greenwood District, urban renewal came in the form of the location of a highway, Interstate 244, that barrels right through what was the heart of the Black business community. I've spoken in Washington, D.C., in Minneapolis, in Indianapolis, and talked about urban renewal. And it's really familiar stories and familiar language to folks in communities of color all around the United States. Oftentimes, urban renewal projects, no matter how well-intentioned, harmed irretrievably communities of color. And why do you think that might be? I think it might have to do with the fact that communities of color are often voiceless and politically powerless and unable to resist these things like constructing highways and so-called cleaning up of blighted neighborhoods and so forth. The other factor that I think is even more compelling than urban renewal is one that people might find counterintuitive, and that is integration. So we think of integration as a positive value. I certainly do. We know that Black folks supported integration, went to great lengths to make sure integration happened. But if you think about why the Greenwood community existed as a business community in the first instance, you'll understand why integration is a negative factor. The Greenwood community was a community of necessity. Black folks created businesses and plied their trades in the Greenwood community because they were shut out of the mainstream economy. So they created what some would call an economic detour, an insular Black business community that was successful because Black folks made dollars and plowed dollars into that community. When integration comes along, it undermined the financial foundation of the successful Black business community. And therefore, in terms of business, integration was a negative factor. And today, as a result, we have an integrated community. We have kind of an amalgam of different kinds of interests: residential, commercial, educational, cultural, entertainment, religious. It's all here. But it's a community that's really in search of unity and in search of a different incarnation of that Black Wall Street moniker.
It's interesting. I'm curious, because you kind of talk about integration as kind of a necessary evil. It was important to happen, but it did have these, I guess, unintended consequences. But when you talk about intended consequences, the way you talk about urban renewal, it's almost as if it's kind of gentrification via infrastructure, right? You can look back to like Robert Moses in New York City. I mean, this is something that's been going on for time immemorial, but is that something that you feel hit its peak kind of mid-century, or do you feel that that's still happening to this day?
I think we could have a rich, hours-long discussion about gentrification. So I guess one of the things I would say about gentrification currently, and if I'm looking at the Greenwood District, I would say a majority of the land is not held by Black folks anymore, and it hasn't been for decades. So when I think about gentrification in its purest sense, I see it dislocating people of color who own land and property, as opposed to outside interests coming in and investing in property that's otherwise available. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious to, for people that may not know, right? If someone has been down to the Greenwood area and they see that basically one block of historic structure still remaining, they may not really have a mental footprint of what the actual size and scope of Greenwood was. Can you kind of just tell people, if they go downtown, if they want to think about where Greenwood was, what are the boundaries of that? Where should we be thinking about that? Because like, for example, our bookstore, Archer in Detroit, right here, right? We're kind of right there, but there's no markers that kind of show that this is historic Greenwood. You kind of feel like it's basically this one street, but kind of give us some scope and scale here.
So the historic boundaries of the traditional Greenwood community would be Detroit to the west, Archer to the south, the Midland Valley Railroad tracks to the east, and Pine to the north. So it's a bigger community than we conceive today, exactly because of what you described. When we come down to Greenwood, we want to showcase stuff that is historic. Well, what is historic is the 100 block of Greenwood. If you start at Greenwood and Archer and you go north, that has kind of the look and feel of something that is historic Greenwood. Whereas other parts of the community may not, because it's changed so drastically over the decades.
Yeah. We have a question here that's kind of pertinent to what we're just talking about, which says, do you have any concerns that the recently adopted opportunity zones and what the Tulsa Development Authority has been doing in the area lately may be a third wave of destruction of the African American community?
So the question presupposes that there is a live and vibrant African American community on those premises right now. Mm-hmm. And so I think when we talk about the African American community, there are different ways to look at it. So are we talking about lands that were traditionally occupied by African American people? Are we talking about a community of people, African Americans, who may be dispersed throughout the city but live predominantly in North Tulsa? What exactly are we talking about? I think the thoughtfulness with which the TDA goes about its work is what's really critical. Are they involving Black voices? Do they have a full perspective of what's desired by the community? Are they fully appreciative of the history of this land? Those are questions that I would want to know.
No. I'm curious, we were talking before we came on here about the book and about the original book, and you said, in these past few years, for a book that's 20 odd years old, you've seen this increase in interest and sales even for the books. And that's for pretty obvious reasons. There's been a lot of national attention, everything from the Watchmen television show on HBO to leading newspapers doing major stories to we're doing the projects in Oaklawn Cemetery. Everything, there's just a lot of things going on right now that would kind of amplify this. What's the opportunity there beyond just recognition, or is that the most important first step? Meaning, this needs to be on as many people's radar nationwide as possible, and then we can start moving step by step towards actual actionable items.
I should say that I'm an advocate of a three-pronged process that moves us farther along the road to reconciliation. I think reconciliation is what many people would say that they want. They want the community to be reconciled. So reconciliation presupposes, I think, three things. Acknowledgement, coming face to face with our history unvarnished. Apology, which is to accept responsibility for things that were done poorly and say, I'm sorry, I wish this hadn't happened. But that's still not enough. The third prong is atonement, or making amends, making things right as best we can. So I want all those things to happen, and I think we're moving along those lines. Reconciliation is a process and not a point, and I would argue that it's a never-ending process. It's virtually impossible to fully atone for tragedies like this. But I would like to see us lead the way, because I've already alluded to the fact that there are communities all across the United States that have suffered historical racial trauma. And I doubt that we could visit any of those communities where most folks in those communities would say, well, we should just keep sort of ignoring that, let sleeping dogs lie, it'll go away. The stuff is not going away. And if we want to know why, for example, there are fractured relationships between Black communities and the police, not just in Tulsa, but all over the country. If we know our history, then we understand that better, and we're better able to build the bridges that help us resolve those historical fissures.
You know, from when you mention your three-prong approach, I can kind of hear in my head when you say words like an apology, you can kind of hear the devil's advocate of someone saying, no one is alive who was part of that. It made no decisions. Why should I apologize for something I had no part in? You know, and I'm sure you've heard this kind of response before. What's the reaction to a statement like that?
Well, we live in a community called Tulsa, and Tulsa is not defined by anybody's individual life, right? We have an indefinite lifespan as a community, and what was done to us, with us, for us 100 years ago impacts all of us still today. And to the extent that we want to live here and we want to live our best lives, then we have to work to resolve things that have not historically been resolved.
Yeah. We have another question, and they say, were there any other contemporaneous vibrant Black communities like Greenwood at the time, and how much did the World War I generation contribute to this? I don't know if that means like economically, but I'm sure there were some parallels in other parts of the country. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, there were a couple of other Black Wall Streets in the United States. Black Wall Street, by the way, is kind of a curious moniker that was attached to successful Black business communities. It doesn't mean that these are investment banking communities or financial communities. It means that there was a proliferation of successful Black businesses concentrated in these segregated communities wherever they were. So Durham, North Carolina would be one example of another so-called Black Wall Street that was referenced throughout our history. I often tell people that really what happened in Tulsa was a Black Main Street. These were small businesses, sole proprietors. These were professional people, doctors, lawyers, etc., in this relatively small Black community.
Yeah. To the point, we have another question that talks about, you mentioned Black land ownership when you're talking about gentrification and talking about, you know, how you think about an area. It's not just about that. A question about the freedmen, and you've written about this as well, about Indian Territory and how that plays into this larger narrative. And we're kind of in a period where you were hearing a lot about land acknowledgements from the Native community and different things like that. And there is an overlap here, even with, you know, the Supreme Court ruling that we just had just a few weeks back, and how that's going to kind of reshape maybe how we think about this space. Talk about the overlap there between some of the Native concerns and some of the issues you were talking about.
Well, first and foremost, the Greenwood District sits on former Muskogee Creek and Cherokee lands. Secondly, the freedmen have a huge role in terms of the economic success of Black communities throughout Oklahoma. In Tulsa, the Greenwood District, in places like Muskogee, which had a successful Black business community, in some of the Black towns, you know, Oklahoma had more of the all Black towns than any other state in the Union, Boley, Clearview, Langston, etc. The freedmen are really poised to support the economic health of Black communities because the freedmen received land allotments from the various 5 tribes after the conclusion of the Civil War and pursuant to the work of the Dawes Commission in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So this access to land really was an accession to wealth. And the freedmen used their relative wealth to buoy the financial fortunes of communities like the Greenwood District, and again, other communities of color throughout the state of Oklahoma, what became the state of Oklahoma.
Yeah. Once again, we are talking about Black Wall Street 100 with our friend Hannibal Johnson. You can get a copy. We'll be posting links to that in our chat function here, and also we will have plenty of copies in the store for you to pick up. So it's called Black Wall Street 100. We are leading up to the 100th anniversary of this next spring. Hopefully we will be in a better place nationally where we can actually gather and have some more group functions for that. But what are some of the things? We have a question here from our friend Steve Gherkin, who says, what do you hope will be some of the benefits of the Centennial next spring? What are the best outcomes you see from that? There will obviously be a lot of more national attention. There'll be more media. All those things will be happening. But in terms of tangible, actionable items, what do you see coming out of that?
Well, I'm working on one of the things that I think is a tangible item associated directly with the Centennial, and that is Greenwood Rising, the new history center. It'll be a world-class facility that's being built on the southeast corner of Greenwood and Archer. This is a $20 million plus facility. It will be immersive and experiential, and it will be a facility in which patrons will be able to leverage the history of Tulsa's historic Greenwood District to mount challenges to some of the current issues that we face: Black Lives Matter, mass incarceration, educational deficits, healthcare disparities, and so forth. The work of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission will continue beyond the actual Centennial dates. So the Greenwood Rising, for example, probably will not be fully open until October 2021. But the commission will continue to function, promoting economics and entrepreneurship in the Greenwood community. We have a new partnership, for example, with the Oklahoma City Thunder, which is going to do a mentorship program in the Greenwood community. And then that program will continue beyond the Centennial as well. So the Centennial really is an opportunity to catalyze entrepreneurial and economic activity in the Greenwood District, to elevate the profile of the district writ large, and to offer opportunities for collaboration with other organizations who are working, as we are, to heal the wounds of our historical racial trauma. I want to back up just a second to, I think, a second part of a question you asked earlier about World War I. Whoever asked that question raised something that's really important, I think, psychologically as much as anything else. So what happened in Tulsa in 1921 in terms of the massacre occurs right after the conclusion of World War I. So a number of African-American men participated in World War I. They risked their lives. They were treated, in many cases, better on foreign soil than they were in the United States. And they came back emboldened to these communities from which they had come prior to the war. Unfortunately, what happened in a bunch of highly publicized cases was that these men were treated really still as pariahs after having put their lives on the line. There are a number of instances, both with respect to World War I and World War II, where Black soldiers were lynched in their military uniforms. So one of the consequences of having served in World War I for these Black men was they felt much more emboldened to not just lobby for their rights, but to fight for their civil rights, as they did in Tulsa. The evidence indicates that a number of World War I vets were men who sought to protect Dick Rowland from what they thought was going to be a lynching, who defended the Greenwood community during the hostilities of May 31st and June 1st, and on and on and on. So World War I is really a significant factor in terms of these events of racial unrest in Tulsa and throughout the United States.
I want to get to a few more questions from our viewers, but before we do that, you mentioned some of the things that are happening now, and I'm curious, over the last, say, 25 years almost now, you've been putting out a pretty good sized body of work, and it seems like you're always at work on the next project and always just continuing your research. Like I said, there would be no Black Wall Street 100 without Black Wall Street, and it's an ongoing larger process and kind of moving towards reconciliation. But one thing I want to just curious personally, where you kind of see yourself in the city in terms of a voice that you have, because where I see you kind of involved with all these projects, I don't see you necessarily out as an activist, always on the front lines and maybe doing commercials for candidates and all those kind of things. So I just wonder where you see yourself. I'm sure you feel a lot of pressure, or people ask you to do a lot of those things all the time. Where does that fall for you as terms of who you want to be and what you see yourself as in the community?
So I like to think of myself as an honest broker and a bridge builder. So as you correctly noted, I think I studiously avoid being politically partisan. Um, I certainly have political views, and I'm not shy about sharing them. But publicly, I want to engage all sides to the extent possible, hear all voices, uh, share factual information. That's sort of my role. I think there is absolutely a role to play for activists and protesters. I think we all have different paths that we're taking, and sometimes those paths lead in the same direction. But it's important that we understand our space and understand and appreciate the space of others and work collaboratively to create a better community.
Okay. We have a question from Todd who says, is there any consensus among or within the Black community about specific reparations? What's being discussed as an acceptable atonement?
Interesting question. A disclaimer, contrary to popular belief, I do not speak for the Black community, so I can only tell you what I think. So I think discussions about reparations need to be broad, which is to say that reparations means to make amends, to atone, to repair the damage, and there are a number of ways to do that. So one could think about paying cash reparations to living survivors. There are only a handful of those left. One could think about paying money to heirs of survivors who can prove damages, property damages and otherwise. One could think about more collective types of reparations, and arguably John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park is a form of reparations in that the city, the state, and private donors came together to create this shared space that's an opportunity for us to reflect on what happened during the massacre, and what was lost, and what the potential is going forward. I think about curriculum reform as my number one priority for reparations. In other words, for me, if we can reform the curriculum and include this rich history in our textbooks so that we know that it gets taught, if we can include this history on state mandated exams, giving yet another incentive for it to be taught, then that is a form of repairing the damage that goes generation to generation to generation, and stands the possibility for making a lasting, meaningful impact in terms of our knowledge of this history, our ability to address this history, and our capacity going forward to create a vision for the future that involves all of us.
Another question from Mike, who says, there were about 24 Greenwood businesses listed in the Green Book from the 30s through the 60s. Now, people, I think, probably know what the Green Book was at this point. But this was a listing, a travel guide for people to visit and stay with Black businesses and to avoid any issues while on the road. It was fairly popular. What do you think about the influence of the Green Book on Greenwood's business environment? So obviously this was in that period after the massacre, the rebuilding leading into that 1940s kind of peak you were talking about. Were tools like the Green Book helpful in rebuilding the space or keeping it going?
Absolutely. To be included in the Green Book would have been an honor, certainly, because it puts you in this registry for Black folks who are traveling by car throughout the United States. I mean, the Green Book lists essentially safe spaces for Black folks as they travel throughout the United States. And to have your business listed there means that you're going to get more business. And so who wouldn't want to be listed in the Green Book?
Yeah. One of the things that in the new book that you do is, you know, obviously a lot has changed in Tulsa, especially downtown and that area. since 1998 is completely different. I mean, the whole basic area has changed. And, you know, growing up in the late 1990s, the downtown Tulsa as a whole was kind of a ghost town in many ways. Businesses had left. Do you think that the renewal, I'm looking at this as kind of a double-edged sword, I guess, the kind of renewal of the interest in downtown and the utilization of properties, the renewal of old buildings, all these things has a great impact economically. It also gets more people down to see Greenwood, but it also feeds into that problem that you talked about too, about gentrification and some of the ownership issues. How do you kind of square that circle? Because we need a thriving economic system downtown Tulsa, and it does help, I think, in some of these areas, but there has to be some downside too.
Yeah, I think, you know, some people would go to the adage, a rising tide lifts all boats. So, you know, there's a lot of building, a lot of new activity going on in the adjacent districts, including the Arts District, to some extent downtown, and to some extent in the Greenwood community. Those folks are not necessarily Black businesses, but they're businesses, and they're creating opportunity. They're creating additional foot traffic in Greenwood, which benefits the few people who have businesses here. It benefits those who are keepers of our history, because more people are visiting the Greenwood Cultural Center. They're going to be visiting Greenwood Rising, learning the history and so forth. But that needs to happen simultaneously with initiatives that help economically distressed communities, like what we traditionally call North Tulsa, farther north of the Greenwood District, because that's where the predominance of African Americans live. And so if we want to target some of our atonement efforts, then we have to have specific initiatives that economically benefit Black folks who live in North Tulsa. One of the things that happened, by the way, in the run-up to the massacre, and this is a matter of record, is that there were business interests in Tulsa that explicitly wanted to move Black folks farther north and take Greenwood, take the land on which Greenwood sat for their own corporate and railroad purposes. That's a matter of record. And again, let's go back to that conversation about nomenclature. Pogrom. Pogrom is a term that's used largely in Europe, but it has to do really with the intentional effort to move people off their lands, to displace people, right? So all this stuff kind of ties in together. And again, the importance of targeting in terms of our efforts to make reparation, to do the work of atonement.
You know, it's interesting the way you talk about the business interest element there. And it's so important, you know, how you cannot untangle the racial inequity with the business interests, especially at that time. You know, obviously this is at the same time as the Osage reign of terror that's talked about in
Yes.
the Flower Moon, and people talking about taking land from people. I mean, the motivations are very much the same in a lot of ways, which is, you know, greed and power, I guess, at the root of it. Can you talk about real quickly, we have a few minutes left, when you see things, I'm curious what you think about the importance of symbols in our community are. You know, we see a thing like, for example, the Brady Theater, you know, renaming itself or going back to the Tulsa Theater and taking that name off there, the renaming of streets. There have been a lot of these efforts over the past 5-10 years, in some ways leading up to this. And I wonder what you feel that actually does for the community, how important that is.
Well, I think we have to ask ourselves, who is it in our past that we want to elevate and emulate? And once we do our due diligence and we find that the actual biography or history of this person or these persons is not consonant with our goal of raising them up, then I think we need to make a change. But when we make the change, it's important for me that at a minimum, we footnote that with an explanation as to why the change was made. For example, when we take Brady's name off the theater, which is appropriate in my estimation, let's put on a plaque or somewhere, you know, this was originally known as the Brady Theater. It was originally known as Tulsa Convention Hall, but became the Brady Theater. Talk about what led to the decision to change the name. We don't want to lose that history, that process history. Change the name as appropriate. Keep the history, the process that we went through to make this decision.
Yeah. I think a couple people are having some trouble with your video feed, Hannibal, just to take a second there. Do you see a little...
It's frozen.
Yeah. Do you see a little button on your left there that says stop video or start video down in the corner
Yeah.
there? Hit that a couple times. I'm just curious if that will do anything for you.
Okay.
Maybe that will.
It's still, I don't know why it's still spinning. I noticed that it was frozen, but.
All right. Well, we can still hear you, but we're about to wrap up. So apologies, everybody. We had a little technical difficulty there, but pretend like we're on a podcast for a few minutes. I just want to end by saying we do have a lot of questions here. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody, but this is obviously a topic that has a lot of interest. I would encourage you all to get a copy of Black Wall Street 100. It's a great read leading up to the Centennial. If you've already read Black Wall Street and you think you kind of have this covered, you don't. There's a lot of great new information in here, so I would encourage you to do that. Last question is, you know, I always say I call myself kind of a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist for various reasons. You know, what gives you hope in the moment we're in now? Because there's a lot of dark forces at work. When you turn on the news, it's some tough stuff happening out there. How do you keep from being overcome with all of
it? I am an inveterate optimist, number one. Number two, I am hopeful because I focus locally, which is to say that I'm doing things that are, I think, moving the needle, if only incrementally. And I'm doing them right in this space with local folks. If I spent all my time watching the national news, I would be probably in a catatonic state of depression. So I think of something Arthur Ashe said that's always stuck with me. It's so simple but profound. And he said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And that's kind of the way I think about it. I know that I'm doing things of value to the community. I'm working with some great people in the community. I know that we are making some change incrementally. So that gives me hope for the future.
Yeah. Well, I'm hopeful every time I read your work. So thank you for doing this. And I'm really looking forward to, hopefully, I think you'll be having a lot of conversations about this book over the next several months. And at some point when we can reconvene and gather again, I hope we can do some more stuff together. So I want to say thank you to everyone for watching and for your great questions. And a huge thanks to Hannibal Johnson for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great Sunday. And we will see you very soon. Get your copy of Black Wall Street 100. Take care. Have a good week.